I'm Tim Wildman with Dr. Ray Pritchard. Ray's co-hosting with me today. Speaking of America's economic situation and the wealth we have developed over our country's lifetime, how we've been blessed, we also had a lot of people work hard and have great ideas and ingenuity and being able to benefit from those ideas and that hard work. Well, is that at risk, I guess I would ask. And we're going to talk to a gentleman right now who is sort of warning us that, yes, life as we've known it here in America, in terms of economically, and the way the free enterprise system works and how it's benefited us all. It's as my dad used to say, it's the best for the most. Joining us to talk about this is Samuel Gregg. He's the author of Becoming Europe, Economic Decline, Culture, and How America Can Avoid a European Future. Samuel, welcome to our program.
Tim and Ray, it's wonderful to be with you today.
Now, you are Director of Research at the Acton Institute.
That's correct.
Tell us what you guys do.
We were set up 20 years ago to basically study the relationship between theology, philosophy, and free market economics, because we basically argue that the best way for people to realize human flourishing in the economy, as well as produce the wealth that allows us to diminish poverty around the world, is through the free enterprise system, and that this system is in fact very reflective of some central Christian truths about the person, that we are creative beings, that we've been charged with dominion and stewardship of the earth, and that we're responsible for allowing that world to flourish, to produce material wealth, and in the process of doing so, flourish ourselves as human persons.
Is that English, Australian, or
Good question. I was born in Australia, but I did my doctorate in England, and I've been living in America now for 12 years.
So it's a hybrid.
Tribrid, yes.
Gotcha. Well, that's interesting. So you heard my comments and Ray and I talking a few minutes ago. So your book is called Becoming Europe. You're really concerned that, and you and a lot of people are concerned that we're seeing a switch over from from what system to what system that concerns you.
Well, the thesis of the book is that essentially over the past 5 years, but even for some time before that, the United States has been moving away from its classic market-orientated, business-orientated, free enterprise-orientated foundations when it comes to the economy, towards what you find in Western Europe, which is much more about what you might call social democratic values, social democratic priorities, in which there is a very large welfare state, in which there is extensive intervention on almost every level of the economy by the government, and in which there is a top-down mentality by which people expect the government to provide security. And there's an attitudinal and value dimension to this as well, in the sense that study after study shows that in Europe, people look for their economic salvation, more or less, from the government, whereas in the United States, traditionally, people have emphasized freedom as the way that we realize economic prosperity and security. And the book basically explains how Europe ended up in this situation, but then it looks and says, well, how is this manifesting itself in the United States? And I say, to a certain extent, yes. The fears that many people have that America is becoming like Europe, there is a great deal of reality to that fear. And the book also outlines some ways in which I think America can get back to the genius of the free enterprise system and the cultural values that underpin it, and not go down the path of Western Europe.
Sam, you've got a chapter in your book called Soft Despotism. Tell us what that's all about.
Well, soft despotism is a phrase that comes from the French philosopher Alexis de Tocqueville, 19th century French philosopher, who wrote perhaps the most important book about the United States, some argue has ever been written. It's called Democracy in America. And in this book, when he came to the United States, Tocqueville looked around and said, okay, what is the future of democracy? What are its strengths and what are its potential pitfalls? And he said, one of the potential pitfalls is that in a democratic system, people can move towards a mentality whereby they vote for those politicians who promise to give them whatever they want via state power. And the politicians guarantee to the citizens that they will do that in return for their acquiescence in whatever measures the politicians need to take. And he called that soft despotism because it's not despotism in the sense that we used to understand that, in the sense that we are violently oppressed. We have our rights and responsibilities taken away from us. By soft despotism, he's referring to the idea that we basically give up these freedoms ourselves in return for government-funded security, government-provided security. And he basically argued that this is a real temptation in any society which has democratic mechanisms of government. And I think it's true to say that if you look at much of Western Europe today, soft despotism is what we see. We see a political class that basically goes to the election every time and sees who can outbid the other people in terms of what they can use the state for to provide people with what they want. And the citizens more or less go along with this system. Now, there's some economic problems with that in the sense that if you continue to go down that path, you sooner or later start to dry up the well springs of economic creativity. And you can't have government-provided security unless you have someone producing wealth in the first place. But there's a moral problem as well, and the moral problem is that people become dependent. They become dependent on the state, and they cease to look to themselves and their own initiative to create wealth and provide economic prosperity and security for themselves and their families.
It would seem to me, Sam, that just listening to what you've just said, haven't we already in America gone pretty far down that road?
Certainly, yes. In the book, I basically say that some parts of the United States, such as the state of California, the state of Illinois, some parts of the northeast of the United States, are more or less already there in terms of what we call soft despotism. But there's also some curious cultural problems that are manifesting themselves as well, which I think are also reflections of this soft despotism issue. If you ask Americans, for example, do you think we need to reform our tax system and our entitlement system, they'll say yes. But even large majorities of Americans think that Social Security should not be touched. Also, it reflects itself, this type of contradiction reflects itself when you ask Americans, do you think we need to limit government intervention in the economy? And Americans will still today generally say yes. But when you ask Americans, okay, are you willing to give up subsidies for your industry or the pork that comes to your state or your electoral district, then the answer becomes a little different. So in other words, it's almost as if many Americans don't like soft despotism. They don't like the idea of direct subsidies and government intervention, except when it benefits themselves. So that type of contradiction, I think, reflects the fact that Americans remain very attached to the ideals of limited government and free enterprise. But practically speaking, a lot of Americans have moved in the way that they think about these issues when it comes to policy in the direction of accepting that type of economic model, which is, I think, in the long term, deeply problematic for not just economic freedom, but freedom as a whole throughout the United States.
The book is called Becoming Europe, Economic Decline, Culture, and How America Can Avoid a European Future by Samuel Gregg, our guest this half hour. Samuel is Director of Research at the Acton Institute, ACTON, author of many books. This particular book, do you have a place to go get it?
Amazon.com. Amazon.com, Becoming Europe.
Let me ask you this. What we see, I know you're not an economist, right?
Well, I have economic training. I'm okay. One of these strange hybrids who's done economics as well as philosophy.
Okay. What we see happening in Europe, economically, in Greece and in Cyprus, and now I guess some people say next up is Spain and or Italy. This austerity measures that are having to be imposed to make the European, the European Union happy?
Mm-hmm.
Is that what it is? It just seems like to me, it's. I guess what I'm asking is that going to those kinds of things? Is that going to reach us here? in America?
Well, it seems to me that, and I talk about this in one of the chapters of the book, that the financial situation in Europe in terms of things like deficit, levels of deficit, public deficit spending, public sector debt, is extremely high. And that's the price they're paying really for European unification. It's also the price you pay for large welfare states and a refusal to deal with the fact that if you have large welfare states, it tends to strip away the very basis upon which welfare states can be paid for. Now, one of the differences between America and Europe is that America has the world's reserve currency. So theoretically speaking, we can't go bankrupt in the sense that we can just print more money. But that means that we would go down an inflationary path in terms of getting out of our debt problems, which I think would be devastating for anyone who saves money, but also for those people who are poor or are on fixed incomes. But that said, I also think that the debt problems that you see manifesting themselves in Europe are very much present here as well. We do have this problem on the part of Congress and the federal government in restraining expenditures. We also have the problem whereby our welfare state is growing to the point where it's now consuming something like anywhere between 66 and 70% of federal government expenditures. So all the dynamics that we see manifesting themselves in Europe are in place more or less in the United States. We're not as far down the path, but we're heading down the path. We do have the advantage of being the world's reserve currency, but that's very much a poison pill, I think, when it comes to dealing with some of these problems. And in fact, it discourages us from facing up to just how bad some of these fiscal realities are for us. So do I think that we're going to end up like Greece tomorrow? No. Do I think we're going to end up like Cyprus tomorrow? But if you ask me that question in 10 or 15 years' time, I'm not sure I'd give you such a decisive answer. I'd say, well, I think we might be heading down that path sooner than we think. And unfortunately, the political class doesn't seem to have the will to address the problem in any systematic way. Well, but also a good number of American citizens, I think, don't really have the will to address the problem in the systematic way. They're happy to pass the problem on to their children.
No, I agree. I agree with that. A majority of Americans, a slight majority, by voting for President Obama, I think said that, I don't want to say they said they don't care, but it's not important. The debt issue, the $6 trillion that President Obama added on his watch, that doesn't faze a majority of people. They just say, I don't even understand that. What do I care? Somebody else can pay it. I think that is the attitude that a majority of Americans take, because President Obama's, the debt that he added was breathtaking, and then there was no consequences to pay for it. So if there's no consequences to pay for something that's unprecedented and puts us $6 trillion more in debt, threatening our country's economic future, and then people say, hey, give me some more of that, then it's hard to say that the American people are even, a majority of us are even really serious about dealing with this issue or even know what to do.
Well, that's an important point, because you mentioned a word there that's quite significant, and you said attitude. Yeah. And I think that's part of the problem, and one of the theses of this particular book, Becoming Europe, is that the attitudes and beliefs and value systems of people tend to be a driving force in what we prioritize in economic life and economic policy. Laws and institutions are very important, but if people place a premium on security through the state and they don't care about the long-term consequences for either themselves or, frankly, for their children, then there's no incentive, and especially in democratic systems, for the political class to do anything that would suggest to people, no, we have to restrain ourselves now, otherwise our children are going to have a miserable economic future. And one of the arguments of the book is that unless we have attitudinal change on significant levels and with regard to some pretty significant issues, we are going to be in an economic hole for a very long time.
Becoming